It is 11 o'clock at night in the old house where I grew up, the house with the brass mailbox and the garden that smelled of jasmine in the summer. Tomorrow is the day that is supposed to be the happiest of my life. Tonight, my mother brings me a cup of warm tea and tells me to calm down. I drink it because she is my mother and because I trust the ritual of being cared for. I trust it with everything I have. My name is Amanda Claire Bennett. I am 30 years old, and I work as a marketing director for a small nonprofit in the city. The next morning, I wake up with my head buzzing, my mouth thick with metal, and the hair at the back of my head gone, as if someone had erased my past with clippers. They thought they could ruin me in the quiet of night. They were wrong. When the chapel doors opened the following day, 200 people did not only see a shaved head, they heard the recordings, watched the receipts, and watched a life of curated images dissolve in front of them. This is how a family that spent decades building a reputation on polished photographs and devotions found itself exposed. You will hear step by step how I found proof, who helped me, and how I turned a moment of private betrayal into a public reckoning. The week before the wedding had been thin with rehearsals and interviews and last-minute seating charts. The guest list was a ledger of obligations. The country club had been booked 6 months in advance, and the rehearsal dinner had been arranged inside the glass room that faced the lake, every table set with linen napkins and a single white rose. My fiancé, Leo Martin, is 32 and runs a small architecture firm. He is careful with plans and even more careful with people. He wanted a simple ceremony a year ago. My family wanted a spectacle. They paid for the cake and the tent and allowed themselves to be photographed. I moved back into the house for 2 weekends to help my mother with centerpieces, and each time I felt an undercurrent I could not name. The house was full of photographs of smiling people standing under the same chandelier, the same club crest framed in oil. My parents, Evelyn and Charles Bennett, are known in our town for their philanthropy and for chairing the club board. Their friends called them steady. To everyone else, their life looked seamless. To me, the seams had always been visible. I spent evenings on the phone with vendors, tasting cake, and trying on veils under fluorescent lights in a rented bridal suite. I rehearsed vows in the mirror and counted breaths to keep my voice steady. All of that felt real in a way my family ritual did not. There was a tension between what I wanted and what had always been expected. I kept my engagement small on social media because I wanted privacy, but the invitations that went out were ornate and heavy and meant to be seen. My life until that point was a pattern of being the child who performed normalcy even when everything was unstable. I am the oldest of 3. My brother Michael became the favorite, the one we toasted as the one who inherited charm. My sister, Claire, moved away and married into a family that values discretion. When I was 14, our father lost his job for reasons they never explained at the dinner table, and my mother started working double shifts at the club. I learned to smile through the unease and to cover up. I won awards in school, and they framed them and put them on a shelf next to trophies Michael won for sports. I learned early that reputation was currency. I learned that if you could cultivate silence around certain things, you could keep a family portrait intact. There were small signs over the years, patterns of favoritism that tasted like sugar and sook. A scholarship for Michael, a letter of apology tucked into Claire's suitcase before she left for college, an envelope with cash slipped into the hand of a board member after a difficult vote. I cataloged these moments in my mind, like a librarian of grudges. Each time I decided I would not be the drama, I would not be the one to speak. Each time I swallowed another indignity, I told myself it was for peace. That strategy held until the night of the tea. When I think back to my childhood kitchen that night, I can remember specific textures, the linoleum cold under my feet, the faint smell of lemon cleaner from the counter, the way the tea steam rose against my cheek and smelled of chamomile and something else I could not place. The moment my mother handed me the cup, she touched my wrist in a way that felt rehearsed. "Just breathe," she said, that same line she used at my school recitals when my hands trembled. I took a sip, and the room tilted in a way that felt like someone had pulled a blanket from under me. I remember the sound of the clock in the hallway, and then the sensation of everything softening, as if the house itself was exhaling. When I came to, there was a pair of clippers buzzing in the next room. I remember the metallic pop in my mouth and the way the bathrobe felt like a sheet in a morgue. The clippers stopped, and my mother said in a next room voice, half apology and half determination, "You will be a statement either way." I gibbered at her like a child, and she laughed in a voice I did not recognize. That was the rupture. I will be precise about what happened, because precision was the one tool I had after. I found myself in a bathroom mirror with my hair on the floor. My head had been shaved in sections. The back of my skull showed the blunt lines of clippers. My scalp smelled of disinfectant and cut hair and something like bitter almond. My ears still rang from the buzzing. There was a handwritten note on the sink, a cruel, neat sentence. "Remember why we did this." At first, I could not understand who had permission to do this. My fiancé was still at his own apartment preparing tuxedos. My mother had an explanation that sounded rehearsed when I demanded one. "It will make you stand out," she said. "People will remember the courage of the bride who did not hide." The meaning of courage shifted in my mouth into cruelty. I asked my father over the phone what had happened, and he said he could not come because of a board meeting. My brother texted a single emoji. My sister called and used comfort in a way that felt like glue rather than balm. Behind the domestic shock sat a calculation. That day, I made a decision in the mirror while peeling hair from the sink. I would not let them control the narrative. I would document everything. The morning of the ceremony was a study in sensory cruelty and strategic survival. I sat in a borrowed robe in the chapel's dressing room that smelled of old incense and commercial shampoo, and tried to hold my body steady while the dressmaker pinned fabric at my hips. People were arriving at the chapel, and the light outside was sharp. The veil that someone had picked out hung heavy on a stand like an accusation. That morning, I had a small network of allies that I had not fully formed in my mind until I needed them. Riley Thompson, my best friend since college, and the only person who had seen me cry and laughed with me at midnight over cheap takeout, had insisted on driving me to the venue. Marcus Lee, the AV technician the club hired, was quietly suspicious of the family politics. He had seen discrepancies in the event orders and had once muttered that he would never let a family stage anything without him filing receipts. Pastor Alan Crawford had been asked to officiate and had a kindness that masked a stubborn sense of justice. Aunt Louise, Charles's sister, arrived with a pot roast for the rehearsal and a sideways look I had always misread as judgment. Each of them, in different ways, became a note of trust. At first, the plan was simple and surgical: collect proof that could not be erased. I asked Riley to film me with her phone, raw and unedited, the way my head looked under studio lights. I asked Marcus to check the security footage from the house the night before and to pull any audio that might exist from the club's cameras that recorded the rehearsal dinner. Pastor Alan Crawford had been asked to officiate and had a kindness that masked a stubborn sense of justice. Aunt Louise, Charles's sister, arrived with a pot roast for the rehearsal and a sideways lurk I had always misread as judgment. Each of them, in different ways, became a note of trust. At first, the plan was simple and surgical: collect proof that could not be erased. I asked Riley to film me with her phone, raw and unedited, the way my head looked under studio lights. I asked Marcus to check the security footage from the house the night before and to pull any audio that might exist from the club's cameras that recorded the rehearsal dinner. Pastor Allen agreed to keep a tape recorder during his private rehearsal with me, where I would speak a small part of my own vows. Aunt Louise offered to take custody of any physical evidence left behind. Forensic thinking has its own rhythm, one of chain of custody and metadata that cannot be shaken by family narratives. I began to assemble a timeline of receipts and messages. I found a delivery receipt for a box of clippers purchased 2 days before the wedding on a card that traced back to my mother's account. I found a voice message on my phone from an unknown number that played my mother humming in the background while I described to Leo how happy I was. I found a note in my father's study with the invoice for a sedative that matched the compound that showed up in preliminary chemical tests. Each piece was small, but together they formed a mosaic. The technical details matter because this is not a story of feelings alone, it is a story of evidence. I want to explain in plain language what we did so that anyone who finds themselves in a similar place can see the scaffolding of method. The extraction of audio from damaged files required a frequency analysis and noise reduction that Marcus set up using open-source software and a small external sound card. He isolated the human voice using bandpass filters and then matched timestamps to the club's surveillance clock to confirm sequence. That procedure is technical but replicable, and it yielded an unambiguous segment where my mother spoke of making a point and a second voice that sounded like my father agreeing. For hair sample analysis, we submitted strands to an independent laboratory that ran a toxicology panel. The lab used gas chromatography mass spectroscopy to detect the presence of benzodiazepine metabolites. The report returned positive for a short-acting sedative consistent with the symptoms I described. Chain of custody documents were signed by Aunt Louise and Marcus with phone, date, and timestamps that matched the server logs. These actions were not dramatic, they were forensic. They were slow and bureaucratic and completely necessary. I will not pretend the investigation was clean. There were confrontations that required acting and patience. There was a point where my mother sat across from me at the kitchen table and smiled as if nothing had happened. I invited her to speak. The conversation went like this. "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice small and steady. "We did this for you," she said. "We thought it would make people talk about you, to give you a story." "A story?" I repeated, at the expense of my dignity. "Sometimes families have to do hard things," she said. The exchanges continued, each sentence a blade. "We have always protected the image," my father said on a speakerphone when I confronted him in the dining room. "Reputation is what keeps doors open." "Doors that slam on people who are not useful," I said. "Is that what you mean?" My brother appeared and said, "Amanda, please, this is not the time." My sister tried to mediate and said, "We did not think it would go this far." Marcus interrupted the conversation by telling me he had found a backup audio file with a fragment of my mother's voice admitting to buying the clippers and discussing timing with a neighbor. Each line pushed the conversation into the public domain. There were a dozen such exchanges, and each one had a micro gesture attached. My mother touched the table with the index of her finger, as if to make a point. My father stared at a stain on the wood. My brother avoided looking at my face. I cataloged these gestures because they later became testimony. There were logistical problems to solve in the hours before the ceremony. My dress was in a press, and the seamstress had to modify a design to fit a new silhouette. The makeup artist, who had come at my insistence because she was a neutral outsider, sat me down and said, "We can work with this. There is a way to make this look intentional." The veil remained a puzzle. I considered wearing it as a literal veil over my shaved head to reclaim the symbol. In the dressing room, I had a long conversation with Leo. He arrived in a suit he said he had bought the week before, his hands shaking a little as if he had rehearsed a speech and lost the lines. "Amanda," he said softly, "I love you. This is not what we planned." "I know," I said, "but I need to do this my way. Will you stand with me?" He paused and then said, "I will stand with you, and I will speak the truth if you ask me to." There was a dozen short lines exchanged between us, each one carrying the weight of consent and fear. He asked if this would bring shame to his family. I told him that shame had been stored in my family long before him, and that I was ready for the consequences. He nodded and squeezed my hand. The moment I decided to expose them came from a calculation about audience and optics. The reception would have 200 guests, including local council members, the club board, journalists from the society pages, and the same people my parents cultivated. It was the perfect stage in their minds and in mine. I imagined stepping up to the microphone, not to beg, but to present facts. I worked with Pastor Allen and Marcus to set a sequence that could not be interrupted. Marcus would cue a video on the main screen that would show the footage from the house, the audio that contained admissions, and a timeline overlay with receipts and metadata. Pastor Allen offered to speak a few brief words about honesty and community before I took the microphone. Riley agreed to stand by with her phone streaming live to a private server so that the footage could not be taken down by a family member who might try to edit it. Aunt Louise agreed to hand a pile of printed documents to the club manager and to the local newspaper's editor who I had texted with a summary of the investigation and a request for impartial coverage. The plan had to be airtight and calm. We rehearsed the sequence in whispers in the back room. We practiced the exact order of the slides and the 2-minute clip that would play on loop until the congregation absorbed it. There is a type of cinematic tension that happens in a room full of people when the expected ritual is about to be interrupted. The chords of the string quartet softened, and the organist struck the opening note. When I walked down the aisle, I felt every texture of the chapel, the cool wood of the pew under my palm, the warm perfume of lilies from the front arrangements, the hush of the chandelier above that cast a pattern of light like spots on a film. I wore the same dress I had chosen weeks earlier, but altered to allow the veil to sit differently. The veil became a banner rather than a concealment. I had 12 exchanges of words with the officiant, in which I asked him to begin, to give me a small space, to let me speak without interruption. He nodded. The audience looked like a sea of faces I had memorized from childhood. My father sat in the front row with a color in his cheeks I had never seen before. My mother carried herself as if still in control. My brother sat with his jaw clenched. As Pastor Allen read a short devotional about truth, the projector failed briefly and then came alive with the first image. The video began with a shot of my living room at 10:30 the night before. The colors were flat, the lamplight shadowed. There was a timestamp that matched the phone logs. The audio track played next. It contained my mother's voice asking, "Have you done it yet?" And a second voice saying, "Soon, we will make them remember what family does for one of its own." There was a clip of clippers being purchased online with a delivery confirmation and a card used by my mother. The audio included a hummed tune that matched the voice message on my phone. The congregation sat in a silence so deep the organist's sheet rustled audibly. People leaned forward. My father's face turned ashen, and he reached for his napkin as if to steady himself. The projector then showed the toxicology results and a highlighted passage from the lab. I watched my parents move through a sequence of micro-expressions that were all recorded, as if in slow motion. I had Marcus cue the second file that contained my mother had left me a year earlier, where she spoke of keeping our story intact and being strong for the club. The room reacted with a soft intake of breath, and then a low murmur that spread like a wave. I had planned for the chain reaction. The club manager stood up and demanded an explanation. The board members murmured that they needed time to review. The society reporter pulled out her phone and began typing a storyline in real time. My brother stood up and attempted to shield my parents. He said, "This is our family. Please have mercy." I stepped forward and said, "Mercy begins with truth." There were exchanges around me, phrases thrown like objects. "This is staged," someone claimed. "Where is the proof this is not an act?" another voice demanded. I handed Aunt Louise a folder, and she passed it forward. The receipts, the lab report, the audio transcript were placed on a podium like evidence in a trial. The club president, a man named Gerald Whitmore, whom I had seen smile at galas, turned pale and started insisting on an emergency meeting. People began to stand and whisper. The reputations my parents had curated for decades were behaving like fragile glass under the light of a projector. The aftermath in that room was immediate and practical. A vote to suspend my parents from the board was called within the week. The local paper ran the footage on its website with a headline that reduced a family mythology to an investigation. Legal counsel reached out to both families. There were calls that felt like avalanches. My parents hired a lawyer who sent cease and desist letters to the club and to the newspaper. I secured a restraining order for a short time because the first reflex of a family that loses control is to manipulate. The community that had once bowed to my parents split into camps. Some friends texted me words of support. Others sent condolences for a perceived scandal. The club instituted a temporary review of its event policies and began an investigation into procurement and vendor payments. It was messy, it was public, it was necessary. Here I want to pause and ask you something. I want you to write in the comments one sentence that begins with "I would have." Start with that phrase because I am collecting small acts of human courage, and the way we imagine action matters. If you have ever been in a room where your safety was negotiated by someone else, tell me what you would have done. If you have advice for someone who is starting to collect proof, say it. If you want to share a detail of your own recovery, write a line and know that I read them. Comments matter because they turn stories into lifelines. They help other people see that they are not alone. Now I will continue because there is more about how I cataloged evidence and what happened after the projector went dark. There were specific technical steps that mattered and that I will outline because I learned them in panic and then organized them into a plan. The security footage extraction required that Marcus copy raw camera files from the house DVR and convert proprietary formats into a standard container that could be read on multiple platforms. He used checksum verification to make sure the files were not corrupted and created redundant archives stored on cloud and on a physical encrypted drive. The audio files were analyzed for timestamp drift and matched to server logs. These procedural steps protected the evidence from erasure and from claims of tampering. The lab results were secured with chain of custody forms and third-party notarizations. I hired a paralegal to help consolidate communications and to create a single narrative timeline. Each procedure I followed was small and bureaucratic, but together they made the story coherent and defensible. The legal side was slow and precise. The restraining order lasted 30 days and was accompanied by an injunction to prevent tampering with the club's resources. My family's lawyer insisted on mediation, while my attorney proposed a civil suit for emotional damages and for damages to my reputation. The public reaction translated into a short-term loss for my parents. They were asked to step down from the positions they held and to return certain donations pending review. A local ethics committee opened a review into procurement at the club. There was talk of criminal investigation for the administration of an involuntary sedative, but those investigations take time and jurisdiction. I focused on what I could control, which was my narrative and my health. I saw a physician who recommended a psychiatric assessment and a regimen to help my sleep patterns and to repair my scalp. The process was long and painful, but it allowed me to maintain a record of medical interventions that corroborated the toxicology. There are moments of tension I will not forget, each one carved into memory in paragraphs that feel like small storms. One such moment came when my father refused to leave a public event at the club and attempted to speak to the board before they could remove him. He stood up in a room full of members and in a voice that had always commanded rooms said, "You cannot judge me in a theater of performance." The room hushed and then split into a chorus of dissent. He was escorted out by security and he slammed the door. The sound echoed in my chest. Another tense point was when Michael, my brother, confronted me in a parking lot and said he could not have known that it would escalate to this. He pleaded and accused in equal measure, and his hands shook. The exchange lasted long enough for a rainstorm to begin. I listened and then told him that silence is complicity. He left without answering. A third intense scene took place at a counseling session where my mother and I tried to talk with a mediator. She said she had acted out of a belief that family image was protective and that sometimes sacrifice must be theatrical. I told her sacrifice that cuts another person is not sacrifice but violence. The mediator watched us both and made notes. Each of these moments lasted in their own paragraphs of memory, and they forced me to rebuild boundaries. There were allies I had never anticipated. The club janitor, Thomas Ruiz, turned out to have a temper for injustice and had noticed deliveries to my parents that he thought unusual. He provided a log of a late-night van that he saw near the back entrance. A neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, who had always been distant, called and confessed she heard a commotion at 2 in the morning the night of the tea and thought it was nothing to her. Marcus, the AV tech, was relentless. He sat in front of a monitor for hours and annotated files and wrote down every irregularity. Riley uploaded a raw video to a server outside my parents' reach. Pastor Allen offered to testify about the words I spoke before the wedding and to support community conversations about trust. Aunt Louise quietly handed me old ledgers that suggested patterns of favoritism and financial exchanges. The names I will keep in my mouth as gratitude: Riley Thompson, Marcus Lee, Pastor Allen Crawford, Aunt Louise Bennett, Thomas Ruiz, Mrs. Hargrove, Michael Bennett when he chose to speak, and Gerald Whitmore, the club president, who finally agreed to an impartial committee. Each person did a small logistical task that added up. The weeks after the exposure felt like walking through a town I no longer recognized. The club that had once been a second home now had tape marks on the entrance and a sign indicating an investigation. My parents' friends stopped answering calls. An old photograph of my family at a gala went viral briefly and then was used in an editorial about the cost of image culture. I received messages from people I had not spoken to in years offering support, and from others who accused me of orchestrating a public spectacle. News crews appeared at the club gates asking for statements. I tried to maintain a rhythm of work and therapy, of calls with my attorney, and of quiet walks around the block. I could feel my life rearranging itself around consequences. Leo stood by me and filed a letter to the club board asking for an apology and for public transparency. He read statements on my behalf once because my voice would shake in interviews. There were nights of sleep so shallow I could hear my own heartbeat like a drum. There is a moral argument threaded through this story about the cost of image and the price of truth. I lost privacy and gained agency. My hair grew back, eventually, but the scars were
deeper than the scalp. The public consequences multiplied. My father resigned from several boards and faced a review that led to a censure. My mother left the club and moved into a smaller house across town. My brother sought therapy. Some relationships ended forever. Some were repaired with work and time. I was sued for defamation by lawyers who claimed that the narrative I presented was harmful to reputation. Those lawsuits took months and were expensive and draining, but they also forced public depositions, where my mother and father had to answer questions under oath. The discovery process revealed more documents that corroborated the timeline we had presented at the chapel. The scene that started in a kitchen spilled into court filings and into the pages of newspapers. In the month after the wedding, I focused on immediate recovery. I went to medical appointments and documented everything. I started short-term therapy and joined a support group for people who had experienced familial betrayal. I filed a civil claim and hired a paralegal to organize the discovery process. I took my stolen day back in small increments by reclaiming public stories through interviews that centered my dignity. I also learned that truth does not always heal relationships. My mother and I had a series of mediated conversations that were volatile. She would apologize and then retract. I installed a security camera at my apartment and changed my passwords. Legally, I had filed for protective orders and consolidated my evidence into a clear packet that my attorney used for depositions. Community responses were mixed, and I allowed myself to feel anger and relief at the same time. 3 months after the exposure, my life had shifted toward a different rhythm. The club's review committee published a preliminary report recommending changes to procurement and vendor vetting. My parents published a short statement that acknowledged pain but attempted to frame their actions as misguided attempts at family performance. The civil suit had progressed and depositions had begun. The local paper ran a piece about institutional culture and how it can protect abuse. I started meeting with a small group that wanted to lobby for clearer event accountability at private clubs and community institutions. We drafted a short petition and gathered signatures from members who were tired of image overriding integrity. I spoke at a small forum about consent and family boundaries and found that my voice had a reach I had not expected. The community conversation was now about systemic changes and not only one night. This gave me a sense that my action had consequences beyond personal vindication. 6 months later, my life looked both familiar and foreign. I had left the house where I grew up and found a small apartment with a balcony and a potted rosemary bush I tended like a ritual. My hair had grown back to a thick bob, and I learned to style it with an acceptance that my image is not permission. My parents attended,
and a few of their friends slowly reappeared, but at a distance. There were no dramatic reconciliations. The club had implemented a new vendor verification policy, and a public board included 2 members who were vocal about transparency. The civil suit settled privately, with terms that included a public statement and a donation to a community fund for survivors of manipulation. The legal resolution did not feel like all of justice, but it felt like a public accounting. I returned to work and found that my colleagues offered a steadiness I did not expect. I used my story to start a small series of workshops about digital evidence and personal boundaries. I found purpose in translating trauma into practical skills for others. There are moments when I still hear the clippers in my sleep. There are days when the chapel lights catch the pattern of dust on a table and I see the faces in the crowd. There are also days when I feel the quiet reward of living with my head high and not hiding a past that they wanted to edit. I learned how to document, how to press for evidence, and, importantly, how to hold allies close. I learned the vocabulary of procurement, of forensic audio, and of legal filing, and I used that language to protect myself. I do not counsel everyone to take the same path. There are risks in exposing family secrets, and there are costs to public life. But for me, the decision to turn quiet humiliation into methodical evidence collecting was the only way to stop a pattern that could have repeated. The story I told at my wedding that day was not melodrama. It was testimony, and it changed things. If you are watching this because something similar happened to you, I want you to know a few practical things. First, document. Take photos, videos, save receipts, get lab tests and medical records. Second, find trusted allies who can hold physical custody of evidence and who are willing to testify. Third, consult with a legal professional before releasing anything widely to understand the risks. Fourth, take care of your mental health. There is no point securing evidence if you cannot sustain the process. Finally, remember that exposure is a tool, not a right. Use it with purpose and with people beside you. The consequences of that night were public and private. My parents faced institutional review and personal consequences. There were legal maneuvers that lasted months and emotional work that will likely last longer. I found a voice and a community that helped me translate pain into action. I rebuilt a life that centered my dignity rather than their image. If you want to hear more about the specific procedures we used, to see screenshots of timestamps, and to learn how to prepare a folder of evidence, subscribe to the channel and I will walk you through each step with real examples and templates that we used. If you have questions about medical documentation, legal strategy, or how to approach a clergy member to be an ally, ask in the comments and I will answer the most common ones in a follow-up video. At the end, I keep a simple truth with me, like a small stone in my pocket. Reputation can feel like armor, but sometimes it is a cage. I stepped into the light not to punish for punishment's sake, but to demand that the rituals that bind families should not be used to violate people. The veil that once covered me became the banner under which I called for accountability. The final image I will leave you with is a photograph taken 6 months later on the balcony of my new apartment. The light is late afternoon, and it hits a rosemary bush and the corner of a small table. My hair is cropped into a bob, and my face is calm. There is a small circle of friends in the background, blurred, safe. The caption reads simply, "Truth changes everything." If this story moved you, subscribe, share, and comment your sentence that begins with "I would have." Your words make a space for others.